Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the Kiwi Ears Quintet. So the Quintet, of course, refers to the 5 drivers that are inside the shell. And this shell actually says Kiwi Ears on. And if you get the right kind of lighting, you can kind of see there's an embossed Kiwi Ears on that one. On this one, it actually does say Quintet at the bottom. If we get some good lighting, we can almost pick that out. So yeah, kind of interesting shells. They have a cool little faceplate. The rest of it is sort of a black, hard to see through resin shell. And you see, actually, you can see with enough lighting, you can actually see the tubes for the driver groups there. So pretty cool. I mean, it is a technically complex set. 5 drivers, 4 driver types, dynamic driver, balanced armature, microplanar, and piezo, all in a tidy shell. The cable itself is actually pretty nice. I think maybe they've used this one before. I can't remember, but pretty nice looking cable that you get for this one retails for about $220. So you do get a semi-decent cable, no, not modular. You also get the Kiwi Ears case and a set of tips, which looks very much like this. So yeah, those are kind of wide. I would still... There's actually 2 sets of tips there, so I would still use the tips that you are familiar with and sound good to you. That's my advice on that one. The box, all the good stuff is out of the box, and I just showed it to you. So let's kind of jump right into it, and we will start with the graph. And again, the graph isn't all that useful on this one, mostly because one, levels are kind of what you're used to, 2, because there's 4 different driver types and how those sound in your ear. They're not what you were typically expecting, and graphing that and trying to interpret what it means, I think that's actually very difficult. It's very difficult on planars. It's very difficult on lots of different anything other than single dynamic drivers. Single dynamic drivers you could do pretty well, but as far as the hybrids, just small differences and driver types and what their tone are make a big difference. So, but generally not all that far from cadenza. So not all that far from probably their house tuning. So let's kind of jump right into it, and we'll start right at the top and say, I think, on the pro side, I think they did exactly what they kind of set out to do. 5 drivers, 4 driver types, successfully working to deliver a resolving hybrid sound and a tuning that works for people. And really the biggest fear I think most people have when they saw piezo as one of the driver types was that you were going to get this buzzy, weird piezo artifact. And no, I think they did a really good job of avoiding that. And I think that was a lot of people's biggest fear. No one was really sure what the microplanar sounds like. Everyone kind of gets what a BA sounds like. The dynamic driver was fine. But I think the piezo was the big unknown as to how much of an artifact it would be and how noticeable it would be. And I think they did do a pretty good job at matching these 5 drivers into a cohesive sound. So does it sound like a $220 set? I think it actually does. I think it does deliver an upgrade over $100 sets, sub $100 sets. I think it does that pretty well. Does it sound like a well executed hybrid that delivers on the hybrid promise of a more technical capable set? Again, I think it does very, very well at that. So yeah, I think value wise, I think they pretty much hit the target on the price for what they deliver. Pretty well. So why does it really matter? And I think this one does sound quite a bit better technically than most sets below it in price and below it in driver count too. 5 drivers, 4 driver types. I think they actually did a pretty good job. But I talk about the 4 BA is sort of about the cutoff where you want hybrids to really sound technically more advanced than what a single dynamic driver can do. Some of the 1+2s, 1+1s, they kind of sound okay, but it's sort of a marginally difference. When you get up into 4 and 5 drivers, that's sort of where you start to notice that there's a real technical advantage to having a hybrid. And I think Quintet actually does a pretty good job at that. So on the con side, I do think the 4 driver types, they do work together in a way that sounds more like BAs. And there's 2 BAs in it. But generally, like I said, there's not really a piezo artifact to it. The planar, you're sort of expecting it to sound maybe like a planar. It doesn't really sound like that either. So I think what the overall if you had to guess blindfolded what it sounds like and what was in the shell, I would say it probably sounds more like BAs than the planar or the piezo. Sounds good, but not really as unique as a set like Winter, which had a bone conductor, and it was pretty obvious that had a special driver configuration, and it was sort of immediately, as soon as you put it in your ear, like, well, this is something different. This one's like, oh, it just sounds like a really, really nice hybrid, and I think if that's what they were going for, I think they did do that pretty well. It does push detail versus natural. I think people who are really into sort of detail kings, detail seekers, you'll be attracted to this type of sound. Those of you who like that smoother, thicker, richer, more natural vocals, I think orchestra is probably, especially in the mids, is probably more of your style. And I think some people, it will just appeal. I think this forward detailedness, push detail, I think will appeal to some. And I do think it is better than most sets below its price, but I think I spent a lot of time with KZ's AS24, and I think KSA's AS24 will actually give this one a run on detail and sounding a little more natural, especially because on the upper mid genres, this one gets a little bright, whereas AS24 isn't as bright, so that part comes across a little more naturally. But yeah, I mean, as far as recent multi-driver sets, AS24 will most definitely give this one a run. If you switch back and forth between them, you sort of figure out that this one just does lean a little bit brighter. AS24 has a lot of detail, but it's not really pushed as much as the Quintet is. So it sounds a little more laid back, but it also sounds a lot more natural. So it's a trade-off, and whatever your preferences are for detail or naturalness, that's sort of where you lie on those two sets. So does it scale with an amp? I think a tiny bit. It sounds pretty good, but what was kind of more interesting to me is it really sounds consistent with impedance. And I was actually expecting 5 drivers to do something kind of a little crazy with higher impedance, and it really doesn't. I think it scales as you expect with an amp. What's more important on this one is it scales with volume. This is another one that has this sort of narrow band of where it sounds really, really good. And I think at lower volumes, it sounds a little less dynamic. Female vocals sound a little less dynamic. So you can actually hear this thing kind of life. It kind of pops open, and it sounds as you're expecting it to sound, very dynamic and a lot of life to it. But it takes a little bit of a volume to do that. And if you push it a little too high, it will tell you that you've gone a little bit too high. The upper mids will pop out of place with a little bit of brightness and say, yep, you've kind of gone there a little notch or two too far. So the upper mids will be your upper bound on that. So sound-wise, this one does have a fun bass, got a safer upper treble. But ironically, in the marketing, they talk about the neutral upper mids. And that's what really sounds less neutral compared to the bass and the treble. It was sort of odd. I couldn't quite figure out why they used that term. But when you listen to it, that's the part that pops out. That's the part that's going to be a little bit spicy. It's the part that pops out when you give it a little volume. So overall, it does lean a little bit bright just because of the neutral upper mids, which sounds like a contradiction, but that's the way it sounds. And stage also takes on the character of tracks. More open tracks, a little bit more sparser tracks, those sound open. Tracks that don't hit those upper mids hard actually sound a bit more open. Busier tracks can really flatten the stage. And something like Richter's, the new Four Seasons, that big open classical style, it's really a great experience on this set, and it's really the sweet spot for music styles. Anything that gets a little busier or hits the upper mids a little bit too hard tends to be a little bit more flatter and a little bit more closed in. But that kind of big open music definitely sounds much better stage-wise on Quintet. So bass, I'll say there's two faces to it. Again, you can kind of see it on this. They pushed a lot of energy out here into the sub bass. Not a whole lot going on here in the mid bass, but when tracks hit the sub bass kind of hard, it sounds like a big bassy sub bass set. But as you kind of work your way in towards the mid bass, it falls back under that mid brightness. So again, those neutral upper mids do kind of color quite a bit here. And that will sort of override, when there isn't enough sub bass or a lot of sub bass, you'll tend to hit this brightness, and it tends to just right on top of the bass a little bit. So, but as a background player to the mids, it really hands over just enough warmth to play well with the, and with the cooler upper drivers, right? So the BAs and the planars and the piezo, not the warmest of drivers. So I think just having a dynamic driver there was actually a good choice to kind of work its a little warmth into the sound. Hybrid bass is always going to be tough because you're constantly comparing driver types. You've got 4 driver types. 3 of those are, very technical, very sharp, could be a little bit colder. So you're always sort of listening to this dynamic driver versus the other 3. So tough no matter whatever tuning they were going to have. I think that you're always going to compare those. But Daft Punk's Lose Yourself to Dance, I think it's just one of those tracks that's sub-bassy enough, and it's really enough sub-bass comes through with, it's almost about 10 dB of sub-bass. Sounds pretty much as it should, and it gets to kind of the point where it kind of crosses over to be noticeable, where you're like, maybe that's like a hair too much. I don't know, it's kind of right on the border, but when you're not listening to tracks like that, it sounds mostly clean and pretty well executed for a hybrid dynamic driver. So the mids, and I think this is sort of the buying point of this one, is what your preference is for mids. Like I was just talking about, this one comes across as very detailed, very resolute. Resolution, detail, speed, like a BA. But the trickiest part of this one isn't really technical. It's engagement through dynamic range and emotion. And this is where I say some people are really tuned into a natural sound. Some people are really tuned into a detailed high-res sound. This one feeds right into that detailed high-res sound, and people who are into that will sort of recognize that right away. Those of you who are really into natural vocals, especially natural female vocals, you'll find that the upper mid kind of colors this one in a way where it sounds detailed and high-res, but not necessarily as natural, because the lower part of the vocals is sort of not truncated, but it comes across as quickly, or it decays too fast. It's not quite as natural as what I was expecting on a more natural set, but as far as a detailed high-res set, it kind of nails that pretty well. So it definitely will appeal to fans of cleanliness and a bit of detail pushing over hearing that really high and low dynamics of a range of notes and a more natural sound, like I said. So one of those things that I was listening to quite a bit on this one was Lady Gaga's Shallow. Those first opening notes. So you get sets like this, which are just slightly bright, a little more technical, a little sharper. Those opening notes, and if you actually watch a spectrograph or VU meter of levels over frequency, and you watch those opening notes decay out, fade out, and listen to what's coming in your ear, and you're sort of cheating and saying, well, I should be hearing something because I'm looking at it decay out. But you do it enough times, you can sort of figure out that this one comes out, or just decays out a little quickly. And if you listen to a different set and listen to the same notes over again and watch it, you can kind of see, you can hear them further down. They stick around a little bit longer. And it's really interesting. It's not like it's unique to Quintet, but it's this style of this very detailed, high-res, sharper, faster. That's just kind of what happens on a set like that. And as you get into more natural sets that tend to have notes kind of linger on a little bit longer, and you really get that lower part of a female voice, and the part that kind of conveys emotion kind of sticks around a little bit longer, and it's a little bit easier to hear. Planars go from the initial attack of a note all the way down to the bottom. You can hear an incredible amount of decay on a planar, and this one just a little bit fast, but again, I think that fast is going to be attractive to people looking for that style. So the treble, upper mids, lower treble might grab your occasional attention. Like I said, just gets a little bit spicy, a little bit sharp there in the upper mids. Why they called it neutral, not so sure, but it definitely lets you know that the volume is too high. And that's also where the detail lives. So it was just a balance that they chose. They tended to push a lot more detail at the expense of being able to turn the volume up quite a bit. Again, pushed more into detail than smooth, like I said, but might catch a bit more subtle sibilance and sharp emphasis. And for me, it's kind of hard to say it's not necessarily really sibilant, but there's a sharpness to it and maybe a thinness to it. There's some female vocals. Again, at weird volumes, you hear more or less of that. So it's something that's kind of kind of may hear it, may not. Your miles may vary on that. I don't know. I couldn't quite decide. I sort of went with the sharp emphasis is what I really ended up deciding. So the rest is safe. The upper mids, right? There's not a whole lot happen in the upper mids. There's no crazy boost out there. It kind of rolls off in the way it should. Yeah, lots of boost and more neutral than the upper mids. Like I said, the upper mids kind of pop out of place on this one. Stage very much varies from really good to okay depending on the balance of the track. Like I said, any hard upper mid stuff like rock music with guitars, too many drums, people singing, like a lot of the busier tracks tend to shrink the stage and makes it a lot flatter. But anytime there's more neutral upper mids, it can definitely flatten and open up into a nice 3D space on the next track, right? It was very much a track-dependent thing where one track may be not as big, and then the next track is just big and open in 3D, and you know there's drums behind you and instruments behind you, and it actually was a really nice 3D space, but definitely not as consistent as I would want. But yeah, on the right tracks, definitely where it should be. So again, thank you guys again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.